Greetings, friends of liberty. Having just returned from Calais, I do hope that you'll overlook the slight congestion I've incurred as a result of my gallivanting about in the wet French countryside. No doubt we shall make do. As the revolution rages on the other side of the Channel, undoubtedly one of its many contributing causes was the extraordinary abuses of the Catholic Church and their rapacious greed in fleecing the population through their tithes and taxes collected to maintain a religious ideology. In addition, the Church was largely exempt itself from paying taxes and had a great political influence, and all these advantages translated into giving its belief system a quasi-monopoly advantage in the indoctrinating of young and old alike, and in attempting to suppress the ever more popular ideas of the Age of Reason. Now, if we return to the 21st century, and this short eight-page paper under review today, we see that its author, Richard Hanania, research fellow at Columbia's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and founder of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, also believes, as I do, that the state can, through bad law, create ideologies. And he has here presented his own explanation for how the ideology of wokeness has become dominant in the United States. From the very beginning, as legal scholar Gail Heriot does, when she emphasizes that law creates culture, Hanania stresses that people have generally misunderstood wokeness as purely a cultural phenomenon. I couldn't agree more, and this is indeed what I've stressed in the beginning of my own series, The Actual Cause of Political Correctness, parts 1 through 4. A typical example of someone who stresses the cultural while ignoring the role of government would be the very capable public intellectual and historian of ideas, James Lindsay, who views the rise of wokeness as a Marxist religious revival. The essence of Hanania's approach, similar to that of Gail Heriot, two of whose articles on disparate impact I reviewed here, is that a specific aspect of civil rights law, the disparate impact rulings, embodied by the Griggs decision of 1971 and reinforced and expanded by the Civil Rights Act of 1991, are the chief cause of wokeness. Hanania, as Heriot, argues that both because of the increased frequency of penalties and the increased size of penalties, after the same 1991 Civil Rights Act, many institutions responded to this increased threat of liability by greatly increasing their woke policing of the colleges, governmental departments, and businesses they controlled, and in this way spread the culture of wokeness, especially over the last 30 years throughout American society. Hanania primarily defines wokeness as the belief that any disparities seen among races or sexes must be due to bias or bigotry, as well as the belief that speech must be restricted by bureaucracies. So typical examples of the implementation of woke policies were when grammar schools have tried to equalize rates of school punishment across all races, which was highly destructive of discipline and harmed the learning environment. And others when police and fire departments equalized hiring rates across races and sexes. Hanania here pointing out that a White House intruder actually got inside the White House because he was opposed by a Secret Service agent without a penis. Hanania believes that government, having the power as it does to create official racial categories, like Asian American Pacific Islander, and to sort people by races, can also thereby create identities, and thus can further divide Americans into various identity groups which wouldn't otherwise form. Hanania also believes that the reason wokeness has only become so virulent recently, since 2010, has been because it takes a while for culture to catch up to the law. In other words, the policies drummed into people as members of all these institutions took a while to catch hold and become a part of their psychology, and also took a while to infect areas of society not immediately susceptible. As well, HR departments in institutions throughout the country started implementing their woke agendas, incorporating these into the administrative DNA of their institutions. And what solutions does he propose? A, primarily to focus on electing the right politicians who can realize the danger of disparate impact rulings, and through executive orders, as well as by bringing the appropriate court cases, change disparate impact law. So having seen Dr. Hanania's argument, how are we to evaluate it? First, what he doesn't spell out or define is not just that law creates culture, which is true, but that rights violating law creates bad culture, and rights respecting law, good culture. Secondly, while Hanania and Heriot are right in believing that law creates culture, the primary problem is that Hanania and Heriot don't recognize how right they really are, in the sense that other law is also creating the ideology of wokeness. To put a number on it, I would estimate disparate impact is only between 33 to 40% of the total causal mix. So what's responsible for the other 60 to 66%? The intrinsic rights violations of public higher education, specifically the totality of its governmental influence, control, and funding exhibited for over a century, but especially after World War II, on American society and institutions. This influence, as I've argued in other videos, has created, even before the rise of wokeness, a much more liberal country and intelligentsia than would otherwise have existed. And thus, this enabled the very passage of Titles 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act, as well as the disparate impact focus of the 1991 Act. Given that these terrible titles were racist and sexist by nature, they represented yet another pernicious and ineffective example of morals legislation, whose harm and futility Miss Heriot herself doesn't recognize, in contrast to that of libertarian legal scholar Richard Epstein, who in his Forbidden Grounds showed their fundamental unjustness and incompatibility with a free society. Furthermore, once the huge amounts of governmental money taken from the taxpayers in the 60s and 70s came pouring into the universities, these helped fund and originate thousands of politically correct or woke departments in black, white, gender, feminist, queer, fat, and disability studies, which laid the groundwork for indoctrinating tens of millions of students in woke ideology subsequently. Apart from any disparate impact rulings. And thus, if colleges started and laid the groundwork for becoming factories of leftist ideology back in the 60s and 70s, then disparate impact in and of itself is only at best part of the reason for wokeness. Another fundamental question left unanswered is whether these workplace rules simply enforce a behavioral compliance or actually indoctrinate workers too. In other words, do they just make us go along with it? As again in the workplace where no white man can ever say anything bad about a female or minority? Or do they change our minds too? So as I argued in my own paper, there is no question of widespread worker compliance to woke rules, but whether this actually overall creates more woke people, not just compliant people, is not clear. A typical example here would be the significant numbers of men who dislike working where women have free rein to verbally abuse them. For these men, the result has likely been more political incorrectness, not correctness. 3 more points should be mentioned. In favor of the idea, as I'm arguing, colleges in themselves produce the ideology of wokeness. Number 1, over 3 times as many young people now complete 4 years of college as 50 years ago, 36 compared to only 11%. So this would partly explain why society has become more woke since 1970. those kids simply absorbing the ideology in the universities. Number two, universities also produce other ideologies, such as green extreme environmentalism and highly irrational transgender ideologies. So if they produce these, it's likely they produce wokeness as well. And so much of the judicial history of Title VII and IX are a history of judges transporting the politically correct ideology they received in elite universities into their judicial rulings, after cases appeared before them brought by feminist lawyers educated at these same liberal universities. This influence of liberal ideology on the law highlights the presence of political correctness prior to or essentially concurrent with the disparate impact rulings. In conclusion, I bid you all a very happy upcoming Thanksgiving, and we'll see you again shortly.